We would like to introduce Colorado Humanities Executive Director, Maggie Koval.
Good evening. Welcome to Breaking Barriers, Expanding Boundaries, the 21st year of the High Plains Chautauqua. Tonight's program is brought to you by Colorado Humanities, the National Endowment for the Humanities, Ames Community College, SDN Productions, City of Greeley Museums, Greeley-Evans School District 6, High Plains Library District, Roach Constructors, the Greeley Tribune, and many, many other donors. I'd especially like to thank the Colorado Humanities Board of Directors and staff and the High Plains Chautauqua Steering Committee for making this event possible. Many notable figures, including Rosa Parks and Mother Jones, will help us understand what it means to break barriers and the ongoing effects of expanding boundaries. I invite you to listen and then join the conversations in the many daytime and evening programs this week. I guarantee you will be enlightened and inspired. It is now my pleasure to introduce Catherine Broderius, High Plains Chautauqua Steering Committee member, a former young Chautauquan, and your MC for tonight.
Thank you, Maggie, for the introduction. I would also extend a warm welcome to everyone watching tonight. Without further ado, it is my honor to introduce Oskar Schindler. Oskar Schindler didn't intend to save Jews from the Holocaust, and yet he did. He employed Jewish workers in his factory, making ammunition and war supplies. His courage and unconventional business practices are credited with saving over 1,000 lives. Please welcome Oskar Schindler.
The nightmares still haunt me of innocent people being crammed into cattle carts like animals, crying and screaming to be spared the dreadful fate that awaited them at the end of their journey. I can still see the horror and pain on the faces of families being torn apart, children being ripped away from their mother's arms, devoted husbands and wives being separated against their wills. Why? All because of their religious beliefs and differences. I was heartsick to see these people live in fear and hunger for 6 long years. Some people might have called me an accidental hero, or an unlikely savior. Today, I shall share my story of how I saved more than 1,000 Jews from being murdered in a concentration camp. It was the year 1939. Hitler told all of Germany that all of our pain and sorrows from the Jews in World War I. I did what most German men did at the time. I joined the Nazi Party to fight for my country. Now, Hitler was invading Poland, and I was seeking selfish gain for not wanting to fight in the war. Since I went to trade school, I knew I could compromise and bribe the officers into letting me create a factory. I soon started up my enamelware factory, which created the metal, the bombs, the bullets, and so much more for Germany. Now, as I started up my factory, I soon met Isaac Sherm. He was a Jewish accountant, and I needed a Jewish accountant to start up my business. We first started out with 45 Polish employees, and I soon found out that Jews were less expensive to hire than the Polish workforce. I can still remember one of my workers coming up to me and saying, "Thank you, Oskar Schindler, sir, thank you." I didn't know what he meant. As I saw my workers working in my factory, I realized something. I realized that they were not just cheap workers. They were mothers, fathers, children. I thought there was no reason to kill. So I made the bold decision not to believe what Hitler was telling us. By 1942, half my workers were Jewish. My attitude changed about the Jews, but Germany's didn't. Because of this, the head SS officer Goth tried to take my workers to be murdered. I was furious. A flame ignited in me. They had no right to take my workers. So I did what I do best. I bribed Goth with black market gifts. I gave him a diamond for each of their lives. This helped me save my workers. As we went back, I still wanted to help as many Jews as I could. So a list was created with the names of each of my workers who was Jew. While the list was being created, I was being contained in prison for bribing an officer. When I got out, we moved westward to my new factory, and My workers were no longer endangered Jews. No, they were Schindler's Jews. Because of the list, nobody could harm them. I let my workers live at a subcamp that was built close to my factory. They had better food and better clothes, and they were closer to work. My wife, Emily, was a big part of my workers' care. She bought medicine for them and nursed them back to health. She also bought food when I couldn't and bought blankets at the black market to make sure that they wouldn't get cold. Now, this new arrangement didn't just benefit my workers, but it benefited me as well. I had workers who were healthier and stronger. Some days, I would tell my younger workers my office needs to be clean. However, I would let them go under my desk and sleep. I remembered there was a little girl. Her name was Raina. She was tall, but not as strong as the men. My head worker moved her from the small machines to the big machines. I saw her get yelled at for breaking one of the levers. I went over and asked her, "How old are you?" She said, 13, sir. I thought a little girl should not be working at a machine more powerful than her. I moved her back to the small machines where she worked her best, and I started checking in on her every day. In 1945, the war had finally ended. My workers were safe and free from the torture of the Nazis. What I didn't realize is that I was in danger of being arrested as a war criminal. My wife and I then left for Argentina. Even then, I sent my workers as much money and food as I could. Sometimes starting off doing the wrong thing can help you become an accidental hero, like me. I want you to think about what I'm about to say. I did what I could, what I had to do, and what my conscience told me I must do. That's all there is to it, really, nothing more. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schindler. Are there any questions from the audience at this time?
Yes.
Is that me?
Go ahead. Yep.
Yeah.
From our
When you
live
talked
audience.
about when you talked about doing a Schindler's List, how did putting the names of your Jewish workers protect them?
That is an excellent question. While the list was being created and they were on there, was like a piece of paper that gave me my authority for owning these workers. So I knew the Germans were very strict and they couldn't argue with if I had fine evidence that I owned these workers. So the list was a piece of paper that showed that I had proof that I owned them.
Thank you.
We're currently getting a question here. Can you unmute your microphone for us? You still have a question?
Yes, I wanted to decide, how did you decide to do
I
Schindler?
can hear you now.
Okay, thanks. And so how did you decide?
Can you repeat
to
that
do-
question for us?
I don't know if she heard me.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, how did you decide to do Schindler?
I decided to do Oskar Schindler because I've always loved the topic of World War II. It's just really fascinated me. And when I first started in Chautauqua, I was told a girl could not play a boy. So I stuck through all these years of playing a male character. So I took my interest of World War II and found a male character that broke a barrier.
I think you did a great job on the accent, the
Thank
German accent. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Stepping back into character, Mr. Schindler, can you explain more about what you think were some of the things that you did wrong or went wrong?
A lot of things went wrong. A lot of it was me being arrested and on the verge of standing up for the innocent. A lot of people thought that was wrong. And I remember getting bottles thrown at me. people just yelling at me, but that was one of the biggest struggles. And even though they thought it was wrong, I knew that one point it could have been wrong, but I changed my mind and I wouldn't go back to doing anything else.
Answer. Are there any other questions? I think we have another question from the live audience. Go ahead.
I'm confused about how many times were you arrested and what were the actual charges? Because when you got out, you were still able to keep your business and your employees?
When I got out, it was because I bribed another officer to let me get out against the charges of bribing an officer. As long as I kept paying them, I was able to stay out of prison, and I didn't care how much money it costed. I had to save my workers, but luckily it was just a few more months and the war had ended, and I got to know that my Jews were safe instead of the threat of Nazis killing them.
Thank you.
All right. Are there any other questions for Mr. Schindler before we transition? Okay, so it is now my pleasure to introduce to you the scholar behind Oskar Schindler, Emiley Massy, or Massy. Emiley has participated in Young Chautauqua for 2 years, and this is her third character. She likes to read World War II books in her free time and is very thankful for the support of her family. At this time, are there any questions for Emiley as the scholar? I have a question off of Facebook. Can you tell us a little bit about how Oskar Schindler is remembered today?
A lot of people actually don't know about Oskar Schindler, but he is mostly known for his list and the movie produced by Broadway, telling his story. So a lot of people have seen that and know him from that.
Very cool. Are there any questions from our live audience? Okay. You mentioned that you had portrayed several other characters before. Do you mind telling us about those other characters that you portrayed and maybe which one's your favorite and why?
My first character I ever did for Chautauqua was Michael Jackson. My second year Chautauqua character I did was P.T. Barnum. And my third year is Oskar Schindler. And I would have to say out of all three of them, P.T. Barnum was my favorite to do so far.
All right, we have another question off of Facebook. What resources did you use to learn about Schindler?
A lot of my resources came from books about him that were biographies. And the girl that was mentioned earlier on in the video, Raina, she wrote her own biography of her survival, and she had her own perspective of Oskar Schindler and the events that he did to help them. So that helped a lot to get a survivor who's still alive perspective on that.
That's very interesting. Do we have anyone raising their hand down there? I don't think so. Did anything surprise you about Schindler when you were researching him?
Something that surprised me with Schindler that I couldn't put into my script just because I couldn't find a place to put it was one of his workers. They pulled out his gold tooth and melted it into a ring for Oskar Schindler when he had to leave for Argentina. And he kept that with him till his grave. And I just thought that was really fascinating to me that he kept that through all those years.
All right, so wrapping it up, do you think Schindler has gone down in history as a good or a bad German?
I think it is debatable for both. People make mistakes, and he made a lot of them. But at the end of the day, he did do something good that helped a culture who was in need at his time period. So I would say he is both bad and good.
Okay.
Thank you.
All righty. Well, thank you so much, Emily. I would like to just take a minute to remind those of you who are watching on Facebook that you can definitely type in your questions into the chat option, and then we will relay those back so we can ask them live to our presenters. All right. So it is now the opportunity. I would like to introduce our next guest. John D. Rockefeller Jr. lived much of his life in his father's shadow. Known to his family simply as Junior, surrounded by the wealth his father had earned and set to inherit the business empire his father had built, he has always seemed to be a smaller and meeker version of the Rockefeller men. However, Junior may have been the braver of the two. While his father simply made the Rockefeller name, it fell to Junior to remake it, to soften the harsh industrialism of his predecessors, to be not simply a businessman, but also a philanthropist and humanitarian. His contributions to the human condition, ranging from support for the Rockefeller Foundation to the existence of Alcoholics Anonymous, stems back to the brutal Ludlow massacre committed by Rockefeller's company men on Colorado's own soil. Mr. Rockefeller has asked me to thank you all for allowing him to speak to you about this tragic and life-changing event.
Thank you, Ms. Broderius, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for allowing me to speak to you tonight. It has been several years since I have been in Colorado, and I must say it is as beautiful as it was then. Now, before I begin, I must ask something of you all. I am afraid I am not much of a public speaker, and if I should stumble over my words or need to take a moment, I ask your patience and your understanding. It is greatly appreciated. My first experience with Colorado Fuel and Iron was as a young man working under my father in our business offices in New York. And, excuse me, as an analyst and advisor studying the company, its functions. It was a merger of several major mining companies in southern Colorado owned by the Gold and Rockefeller families, mining coal and hematite iron ore for the steelworks. Now, in the early years since the turn of the century, mismanagement, graft, and corruption dealt heavy blows to the company. And in 1907, it nearly collapsed. It was through this that I began to slowly increase my presence in the company and ultimately becoming its director. We decided following this financial disaster to replace the upper leadership of the company, hiring Misters Wellborn and Bowers to take the company under their control. These two gentlemen were my main officers in Colorado, and even through all of these mistakes of these last few years, the brutality and the chaos, I stand by my men, my officers and my representatives. I trust them, their decisions, and the consequences thereof. Our company operated a open shop policy. We hired anyone, regardless of whether they had union affiliation or not, particularly immigrants from Eastern Europe, Poland, Greece, the Balkans. They were willing to work for less, and though I say this now with all the historical irony of hindsight, they were less rowdy. It was in 1913, however, that they began a strike organized by one of their members, a Greek man named Mr. Tikas, and in reality, directed by the union, I apologize again, the United Mine Workers of America, which my advisors tell me, and I am inclined to agree, though it was my own men responsible for the massacres, was the bloodthirstiest and most power-hungry of the unions in America. They argued for several points they demanded, ranging from the alteration of pay from long ton to standard, the election of weight checkmen by the workers themselves, the removal of the mine guard system, and ultimately the acknowledgement of the Union of the United Mine Workers of America. Thank you for your patience, as a bargaining agent between CF&I and its workers. Now, only 10% of our workers were union aligned. They were joined by provocateurs, professional revolutionaries, journalists, politicians. I do believe Mr. Roosevelt himself has spoken out about it. Even Mother Mary Jones, who I believe you will hear from later tonight, led a march in Trinidad in support of the workers. Now, we had faced strikes before, of course, in Colorado, elsewhere, and we followed the contemporary wisdom for dealing with a strike. There will always be angry voices, and it does not always require a great response. We brought in strike breakers, Negroes, foreigners, other workers who were willing to work despite the strike. We organized our militia of mine guards, superintendents, local law enforcement, the Colorado State Militia. And while strikes gripped Walsenburg and Trinidad, we evicted strikers from their company homes. If they would not work for us, we would not provide them places to sleep. They would create tent cities outside. It was this tit for tat. When strike breakers began to attack and obstruct, when the strikers began to attack and obstruct our strike breakers, preventing them from crossing into the mines to continue their work, when they attacked law enforcement officers, when they shot a marshal through the back of the head at Segundo, we hired the Baldwin Felts detectives, private police, agency detectives, experienced in the coal fields and the strikes in West Virginia, to provide some muscle, some force to protect our workers, our strike breakers, and our militiamen. When we heard reports that strikers were buying rifles and explosives, dynamite, weaponry, the Baldwin Felts and the CF&I officers began building armored cars and bringing in machine guns. Looking back, the field was set for a disaster. But in the late months of 1913 and the early months of 1914, reports were quite favorable. It seemed that peace was prevailing. Representatives of the company had spoken with the men and with Secretary of Labor Wilson. And the two camps, the militia and the workers, had sat silently in peace and even played baseball games, from what I've heard. However, in April of 1914, I received a telegram, a missive from Colorado, which read as follows. I remember it to this day. Following withdrawal of troops by order of governor, an unprovoked attack upon small force of militia yesterday by 200 strikers forced fight, resulting in probable loss of 10 or 15 strikers. Only one militiaman killed. Ludlow tent colony of strikers totally destroyed by burning 200 tents caused by explosion, showing ammunition and dynamite stored in them. Expect further fighting today. Militia to be reinforced. Suggest you give this information to friendly papers. L.M. Bowers. This engagement at the tent city of Ludlow, called a battle here, is what we know as the Ludlow Massacre, and I'm not ashamed to use that name. I would be the first to call it that. It was horrific and tragic. This was what I heard from my officers in Colorado. What I heard from the Union and from the newspapers, the journalists. Sensationalism and truth mixed together. I saw that death count rise from 15 strikers to 30 to 50 to 100 or more. And then it was revealed that among the dead were women and children, wives, sons, daughters of miners. It was, well, beyond not just a tragedy, a disaster. The Rockefeller family image was effectively destroyed. We were to be brought before the Commission on Industrial Relations. People were calling for my indictment, even execution for treason. It was with all of this that I decided to hire Mr. Ivy Lee, a man calling himself a public relations specialist. A novel idea, but something we needed in just that moment to reform our image and present a more likable Rockefeller family face. Part of his plan to win the hearts and minds of America was to hire another gentleman by the name of Mr. William Mackenzie King, a Canadian man and an ex-minister of labor, to tutor me on labor theory. We would meet every week, and originally it was just part of our public relations plan, but I found myself growing friends with this Mr. King, speaking about labor, learning about why these miners were striking, the conditions in Colorado, learning about their history, reading texts by economists from Marx to Engels on that side, to Smith and Bastiat, and learning of these matters, these affairs, which I had neglected here in New York. As I worked with King, I began to discover and learn more about the situation in Colorado. Ladies and gentlemen, this is something I will always remember reading. A pamphlet put out by Mr. Lee, which read, "No women or children shot by militia at Ludlow," which was true. The women and children weren't shot. No, they suffocated in the smoke of the fires. This sort of deceit eventually earned my Mr. Lee the nickname Poison Ivy. I learned that the fight at Ludlow was not started by some spontaneous attack by strikers upon our workers, but been caused by an antagonism of one of my militiamen, the name of Lieutenant Linderfelt, who'd been antagonizing and provoking the Greek members of the strikers to violent reprisal, justifying ultimately their response at arms. I learned of the horrendous living conditions many of the company towns and bunkhouses were in, how awful the tent cities were. I learned of recent mine collapses in New Mexico and Arizona, southern Colorado. I learned why these men were willing to risk and give their lives to change their lives, change their cities, their livelihoods, why some of them were willing to kill, why there was such a violent reprisal after the massacre. Learning all of this made me look at myself and the life I led, my comfortable home here in New York, my beautiful wife and loving children, my belief, my firm faith in the Baptist Church, in human charity, in respect of human dignity, my support of the temperance movement, of the Bureau of Social Hygiene, of the Rockefeller Foundation, of all of these places in our society where I hoped and wished to improve the lives of the good citizens of this United States, to help the mendicant and the alcoholic and the prostitute find their dignity and their future. And then I looked at not the places I supported, but rather my own company, bearing my own name. And when I look at this war that we have just come out of, our brave young men fighting against Kaiser Wilhelm's army and his German authoritarianism in Europe, and that same authoritarianism can be found in Rockefeller mines in Colorado. I look at my wealth and my comfort and how little of it is actually given forward to our society and to the people therein, how little joy it brings me or others to have. And with these realizations, with this weighty moment, I came to a resolution to embody the ideals I believe I upheld, truly, and to come before those who survived those that I had hurt with humility and to find a way to make meaningful change. It was before the U.S. Industrial Relations Commission, headed up by Mr. Walsh, where I made my testimony. I will admit I was caught off guard by Mr. Walsh's hostile and aggressive questioning, but in retrospect, it did seem appropriate. It was there that I was able to admit in public how little I knew and how little I did. I had not ordered a massacre or our militiamen forward into Ludlow, nor had I ordered the conditions in the mines to be so poor. But I was aware of our militiamen near the camps. I was aware of the practices of my company. And, well, I accepted them without thought. I spoke before Mr. Walsh, and I told him that my trust was with my officers and representatives, with their mistakes. I told the fine men and women there that I should hope that I would never reach the point where I would not be constantly progressing to something higher, better, both with reference to my own acts and to the general situation in my company. My hope is that I am progressing. It is my desire to. I listened to the pastors speak about the conditions. I listened to Mother Jones speak up at the very end of our first day of questioning. And I was sitting there in that witness's stand that I believe was the first step towards finding my path forward. It was afterwards when I spoke with Mother Jones. When I met her, I will admit I was terrified. She is a rather loud woman and I am a rather quiet man. But we spoke, and I believe that we reached some form of understanding. She told me that she appreciated what I said, and I told her that I appreciated what she had. Now, the most important thing I've done in recent years is my trip to Colorado. I had not been there all through my company's operation until just a few years ago. Ladies and gentlemen, I know it is my duty as a director to know more about actual conditions in the mines. I told Mother Jones there should be free speech, free assembly, and independent, not company-owned. Schools, stores, and churches in the minefield. I went to Colorado as soon as I could to learn for myself. It was there that I spoke with the miners and their families, where I spoke with one Mr. Brown and learned of how his fence would not stay up longer than a week, where I spoke with one Mr. Gorecki about how his shoes were falling apart and how he could not afford new ones. I spoke with the children and learned what games they played. I danced with them and smiled and joked and laughed. I remember hearing jokes about me personally and sharing a laugh with the miners. I greatly respect those workers, though I understand if it does not appear so. And on this trip to Colorado, I apologize for stumbling. This is a bold moment, and I believe it is very important to get it correct. I unveiled my new industrial plan, looking at the struggle of union and company, capital and labor, the bloodshed that had come from it. I could not see a resolution, an answer. I did not believe that this struggle was going to end well. So I developed a new plan. If you can picture this table I have before me, ladies and gentlemen, you will see that it has 4 sides joined perfectly together, right square angles. It is situated atop 4 level legs, just like a company should be. The 4 pieces of a company: the stockholder, the officer, the employee, and the director, together must be square and even, or else the table will be misshaped. If they are not level, no amount of money can be stacked atop it. No amount of wealth can be earned for anyone involved. Through this cooperation, I hope to create a better system of labor and capital. I spoke about it with Mr. White and the other leaders of the UMWA, and they told me they fully supported it. And so I put it forward to you, ladies and gentlemen, hopefully to your approval. I call this plan employee representation, rather than representing the employees by means of a union, which may often serve not the people or not the workers' interests, but the unions itself, and not simply giving power to the company to run their workers' lives. Rather, having representatives democratically elected from the numbers of the workers to represent themselves to the officers and the directors of the company, to bring their concerns to capital and ensure that gentlemen such as myself have a true and accurate representation of life in our company towns. I hope to provide every amenity the union can without the need for internal strife like that which led to Ludlow. it is, in a way, ironic. It reminds me of the business practices of my father, in a way. I intend to provide better services than the union for a lower price. At least that is my hope. I hope through this we may have lasting industrial peace. We may find a resolution between the workers and gentlemen such as myself, and that further bloodshed of this kind may be avoided. Further, I hope it may help me find myself in the shadow of my father, create a new path, a new Rockefeller family, one of compassion. Ladies and gentlemen, in future years, I am intending, looking forward to perhaps, using my wealth and influence in every way I can to better the lives of the citizens of this United States, my friends and neighbors, my citizens. Since the defeat of the strike, I've been speaking with members of the Park Service about supporting the Redwoods parks and Acadia, helping to conserve the natural beauty of our continent. Oh dear, my apologies again. For future generations, I am working on other social issues, expanding the Bureau of Social Hygiene, working further to support the Rockefeller Foundation, the arts, looking to purchase and maintain museums and support the humanities within my city of New York. And ladies and gentlemen, I hope to continue this work abroad as well, to help France and Flanders rebuild after the devastation of this war, recreate their churches and their homes and their statues and their farm fields. And ladies and gentlemen, I hope to fully support this new League of Nations that has been proposed. I am confident it will bring lasting peace globally, just as this employee representation plan will bring peace to the workplace. Ladies and gentlemen, I know that I have made some mistakes, and my company has made great mistakes, and people have given their lives for it. Ladies and gentlemen, I suppose you can accept this speech that I've given you here today, this brief speech, as a commitment to rectifying those mistakes however I can, to improve the human condition, the well-being of all people upon this earth, to forge a better future for our children, for us, for their children, for whoever may be touched by it. I apologize for rambling some, but ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Rockefeller. We would invite you to all stick around till the end of the program, where Mr. Rockefeller and our next guest would actually like to take questions together. It is now my pleasure to introduce our final guest of the evening.
Well, when I walked into the building, I could see it was a church, and at one end was a priest with a hat full of money. Boys, what are we doing here? Mother, we rented the church for our meeting. Boys, churches are praying establishments. A union, it's an educational institution along industrial lines. Please never forget, you pray for the dead. You fight like hell for the living. Out to the fields. Oh, and I relieved the priest of the hatful of money on my way out. Please come and meet the most dangerous woman in America, Mary Harris Jones, who spent her whole life advocating for labor.
Well, I have to thank you for having me here. This is the second time I've shared a platform with John D. Rockefeller Jr. And Johnny, you actually spoke some words of truth. Well, the empire builders, of which he is one, you know them, Rockefeller, Lowell, Cabot, Mellon, Carnegie, Frick. But these men, just like Johnny here, built his empire on the bones and sweat and blood of the working man. And these great empire builders, they named universities and museums and foundations after themselves. How would you say, beneficial institutions? Better, they had been beneficial to their workers. Now, the workers, they had a name for me. They called me Mother. I hope I earned it. They even wrote songs about me. Born in 1830, so they tell it. Died in 1930, and I say, oh, they were good. Well, I began my days in Cork, Ireland. Then it was the most populous nation in all of Europe. But did we eat well? No. The wonderful produce that we made. A couple of hundred Protestant families owned all of the land that the Irish Catholics worked. And that beautiful produce they sent over to Europe for profit. We got to eat potatoes. So in 1845, when they first found a fungus in the field, by the next year, the stench, you couldn't believe it. And there went our food, because there was no mercy from those few hundred families. And as a girl of 10, I watched 1 million people starve to death. It's what we called the Great Hunger. You know it as the potato famine. 2 million more left the country to look for work and food. Me da and brother were among them. God knows how Ma held us together through fever and poverty and sickness and the constant sound of the grating wheels of the death cart back and forth and back and forth. But after 4 years, he brought us over and we settled in Toronto, Canada. And I'll tell you, without any embarrassment or shame, I was the star of the Harris family. I took to education like a sponge takes to water. And when I was done with my education, I got a call to go teach at a convent school in Michigan. Oh, Lord. They were so harsh. Well, I got tired of beating the wee children. And so I took up my second skill, dressmaking. And I opened a shop in Chicago. But I must have had wanderlust, because I got a call from a school down in Memphis, Tennessee, 1861. That's when I met George Jones, handsome man, an iron molder, active in his union. I bore him 4 fine children. But in 1867, it all ended. Fever took the poor of Memphis. It killed them day by day. It took my 4 young children, took my working man away. But I found out through those dark nights and through those days no rest that the poor folk are my people from Denver to Tennessee. A mother's job it's fighting for the human family. I wrapped each of their bodies after washing them in a clean white linen. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then my George fell ill. 5 times that sound I thought I'd never hear again. The grating wheels of the death cart came. I was born in 1830, so they tell it. I died in 1930, and I say, to be born, it ain't the beginning, and to die ain't really the end. The struggle goes before winning. The straightest of roads has a bend. 1871, I took up my dressmaking business back in Chicago, got a small shop on Jackson Street and a room in the tenement. But most of the time, I'd be working in the top floors of the houses of the lords and ladies of West Shore Drive. Oh, they had big parks around every one of their houses, and I'm in the stuffy top floor, sawing away. And I could see the mothers bringing their children from the tenements, dragging them all the way out there for a breath of fresh air by the lake. They'd knock at my mistress's door and ask for just a bit of water, and she'd slam it in their face. Well, they'd given to the community ice chest fund, and they were on their ways off to the mountains for the heat of the summer. Well, it was in that same year, 1871, the Great Fire poured through Chicago. Cook didn't hurt the lords and ladies. They were protected by the parks around their houses. But the tenements, do you know tenements? It's one building right on top of the other. Thin, cheap wood, and the fire poured through it. It was like kindling for it. We're all sleeping in the vestibules of churches and tents. And that's when I first heard them speak. Them is the Knights of Labor. And what they said, it made some sense to me. They said, look at yourselves. You're thin, you're weary, you're sick, but it's that body that creates the wealth that allows them to wear fine linen and grow fat. Look at you, your hands are cut and bleeding. They create the product that those men sell so they can put kid gloves on their hands. Look at your children, hungry and shoeless, while you work every minute of the day so their children can ride on ponies on their front lawns. It was in that very year I signed up strong with Labour. I enrolled in the Knights of Labour. And from then, until I was 93 years old, whenever Labour needed me, I went. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking it was dangerous to organise in those days. Of course it was. Everything that benefited the working men and women of this country was dangerous. Still is. This mother was a rabble rouser, a cat organizer. I liked whiskey and barroom talk, spent more nights in jail than out. They put this old mother behind bars to stop her cold. But they soon found out when old's not old. There's enough fight in this old girl to knock the bosses cold. I was born in 1830, so they tell it. I died in 1930, and I say, to be born, it ain't the beginning, and to die ain't really the end. The struggle goes before winning. The straightest of roads has a bend. Well, I organized throughout this country, Virginia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, the mills of New England, and out there where you live in Colorado. And there's nothing you can tell me about the working man I don't know. When there was but one bed, they'd roll over and make room for their old mother. When there was one bowl of soup to be shared, they'd give me spoonfuls of it. But oh, my people, they could be fools too. Let me tell you, there was this one time in West Virginia. Well, first, West Virginia. When I die and go to heaven, I'm telling the good Lord about West Virginia. Do you know why? He never seemed clear to visit it himself. Let me tell you what a company town looks like. I don't think Johnny really explained it proper to you. All those advertisements they sent out to those kind, gentle Europeans who weren't as rowdy as Americans, as he said. Oh, they offered a lovely home, and they said, you'll live in a community with a school and a church and a store, and you'll be well paid. Oh, it's wonderful. When they came, they found they lived in a shack. The floor was the earth. The outhouse so close to the shack that human waste sometimes went right into their home, causing illness. the school, the shop, the doctor, everything was owned by the company. And all that wonderful money they made. Oh, and let me tell you, do you know what dead work is? No? They weren't paid 1 penny for dead work. And the dead work is what made the mines as safe as they could be. It was the men who had to build the stanchions and reinforce all the walls and the roof. But the bosses didn't want to pay for that. They only wanted to pay for the coal because that's what they made their money from. And so that's all they made. Oh, and guess how they were paid? In company script, not real dollars. And the only place they could use that company script was the company doctor, the company store, which charged obscene prices. There was no way that a miner could get ahead. So where was I? I was in West Virginia. I know that much. Oh, yeah. The Pullman bosses used to tell the boys, if you see that Mother Jones by the light of day, throw her off the train. So I rode at night. I would flag down the train after it left the station, and the boys would always stop for me. And that night I was going to this little town in West Virginia where the boys were considering going on strike against a terrible company. There were lots of companies out in the East. Well, when I got there, the boy was there to greet me, and I could look down in the valley, and I told you my people could be fools. I saw single candles in each of the shacks, and the lad leads me to a long building with lots of light, many candles in it. And when we walk in, what do I see? It's a church. Boys, what are we doing here? Mother, we rented the church for our meeting. Boys, churches are praying institutions. Out to the fields. And I relieved the priest that was sitting at one end of the table. I relieved him of his hat full of money that he took from the miners. So we're out in the field. I see a red brick building. What's that? It's a school, Mother. Your parents sweated blood for the right to have that school. You go to the school committee and you ask to have your meeting there Friday night. Have the women clean up Saturday. Boys, please remember, churches are praying institutions. Unions, they're educational institutions along industrial lines. Don't forget, you pray for the dead. You fight like hell for the living. And that is what I tried to tell me boys all the time. Well, there was this other strike in West Virginia. Now, that lily-livered lizard, John L. Lewis of the United Mine Workers. Johnny, you called them violent. Are you kidding? Well, once Lewis got a bit of power, it changed who he was, and he started taking bribes and making deals that weren't right for the workers. Oh, well, this very nice fella, Frank Keeney. Frank, he became president of District 17 of the United Mine Workers eventually. Well, it was a horrible strike. They had closed, one owner owned two of the mines. One of them they had closed down. That was Paint Creek. But Cabin Creek was still working. Now, why would the boss listen to us if he could still extract coal? We had to close both mines. But 50 men had already been killed in this strike. And when Frank went to that lily-livered lizard, John L. Lewis, he said, no, too violent. We can't help you. Well, Frank says, I know one little gray-haired lady who's not afraid. And wasn't he right? He was worried for me. I told him not to fear. We'd rent a wagon and we would drive right through Eskdale. No one would think anything of it. We would look like a grandmother and her grandson. But then we got to Coaldale. No, Cabin Creek. I'm getting old. And the Baldwin Phelps boys were there. You heard Johnny mention them. They're called mine guards. Darlings, what are they guarding? Are people going to steal into the mine and chink away at the coal? I don't think so. They're making sure that organizers don't get in and workers don't get out. And all they are thugs with guns. Well, me and Frank, we ride through Eskdale, and then we get right up to Cabin Creek. And there they are, the Baldwin Phelps boys. And when they see us, every one of them stands and lifts his rifle and aims at this little gray-haired lady. I whisper to Frank, this is going to take some theatrics. I walk right over to the biggest, ugliest gunthog, and I run my finger right down the barrel of his gun. You see those hills? 500 of my boys are in those hills. They hear a single shot from any of you, no one's going to live to tell the tale. And then I left him shaking in his boots, walked right into Cabin Creek and organized them all. Oh, Lord, West Virginia was a triumph. There was this one time, the strike had been going on for a long, long while. And you heard what Johnny said. They usually throw you out of your poor little shack. The money from the union lasts just so long. It was hard, and the men wanted to go back. Well, I was staying with one of the strikers' families, and the little girl is sent home at the end of the day, and she has a horrible fever. But the company-paid teacher didn't see fit to send her home when she was sick. And the mother runs to the doctor, but the company-paid doctor didn't have time to come see a striker's child. And when the mother ran to the store to get some medicine, it was shut in her face. Company store ain't open for strikers. And as that child's fever burnt out into the darkened stars, both her mother and this mother knew she wasn't going to see the dawn. It was that morning I had to speak to the boys. You go into the mines, such young boys. You spend so many hours of so many days bent over. It's easier to stay bent than it is to enjoy the sun for a few hours on a Sunday. The bottom of your shoes are eaten up by the acid in the mine, and the bottom of your feet are more sores than skin. The bit of bacon in your lunch pails, it ain't enough to stave off your hunger. And the thought of your shoeless children and hungry wife ain't enough to cheer your homecoming. And look at you, you feel sorry for yourselves. And you should. But do you feel sorry for your neighbor? Do you feel sorry for your brother? Has anyone ever told you, my children, about the lives you are living here, so you might think about it and create a better day? How do you make that happen, you ask? I got only one answer for that. Working folk gonna rise up strong, right the wrongs we've been under so long. Gonna be a big takeover in this land. All the folks, good names and faces, all the colours from all the races. Gonna be a big takeover in this land. Well, I was ordered to appear for speaking out in the streets. Speak it out, mother. That cranky old judge asked me. He said, Mother, do you have a permit for speaking out in the streets? Yes, sir, I replied. Yes, sir. And who issued it? John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Patrick Henry. Sure as lightning cracks a warning, sure as a rainbow clears the sky, sure as sun brings on the morning, There'll be a new day a-dawning. Well, it was back at Red Warrior Camp. Gunmen from the state militia came to stop our strike. Stop it cold. The state militia used to be regular boys like the miners, but they wouldn't hurt miners, no. They had to bring in the Ivy League boys. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and those were the state militia. Well, I walked right up to one of those boys and I put my hand over the muzzle of his gun. Take your hand off my gun, you hellcat! You're a gun. My class goes into the mine. We bring up the metal that makes that gun. We forge it. Actually, that's my gun. You take your hands off my gun. Black and white walking side by side, yellow and red joining in their stride. Gonna be a big takeover in this land. Men and women proving they can work as one this and every day. Gonna be a big takeover in this land. Well, you might have heard I just got out of jail. Again. And while I was there, I met a young man. And I said, what brings you to this palatial spot? He says, Mother, I stole a pair of shoes for my child. Oh, you should have stolen an entire railroad. Then you'd be a U.S. senator. Sure as lightning cracks warning, sure as a rainbow clears the sky, sure as sun brings on the morning, there'll be a new day a-dawning. Well, I just finished talking to some of the men, and I use a working man's vernacular when I talked. And one of the newspaper boys says to me, he goes, Mother, I understand what you said and I am sympathetic, but the language you used, is that any way for a lady to talk? I set him straight. I said, God Almighty made woman. It's that Rockefeller gang of thieves made ladies. Gonna be a big takeover in this land. Well, we started talking about the women, and the women, they did amazing things. Let me tell you, one time, I think it was 1900 in the anthracite region. Now, this was another small owner. He had two mines, and the McAdoo mine had been unionized, and they had closed down. But this is where Coaldale is. The Coaldale boys were still bringing in the coal, and we had to close down that mine. Now, those charming mine guards that Johnny likes to pay, they were watching the boys like hawks. So I said to the women, meet me at midnight, wear your most colorful clothes, bring your pots and pans. Let the men take care of the babies. So we did. And we started marching the 15 miles over the hill towards Coaldale. We're singing. Well, you can tell how much I like singing. We're singing and banging our pots and pans and having a grand time. And it must have been about 3 in the morning. It was pitch black. And I hear a voice. I'm the colonel of the crack 13 of the state militia. Halt! Oh, I'm shaking in my boots, Colonel. But the working man will not halt. The working man is going forward. Well, he kept us there until there was some sun in the sky. And when he saw, women, and look at those clothes, go on. What harm could we do? Well, we got to the mouth of that mine just before the workers came, and the women, they were yelling, would you rather die working or die fighting? Why don't you grow up here? Be a man. You want to support your families or watch them starve? We got every man's signature or his mark on a union card. Then we went and we organized the trolley drivers to bring no scabs. You know what scabs are? They're bringing in other men to do the jobs. The trolley driver said they'd bring no scabs. Well, there was no one left to organize. So we were getting ready to go. And I saw there was a hotel. Well, I know how these things work. I knew they would be making breakfast for the crack 13 of the state militia. So I said, women, we're going to go eat the militia's breakfast. It'll give us more energy to walk back over the mountain. And I'll tell you, that is what we did. Our women were amazing. They acted as decoys while men shut down the mines. They scared the scabs away. So they often went to jail, and I always told them, take the babies. Between the babies screaming and they're singing, 30-day sentences were turned into 5. Our women died too. Fanny Sellens, an organizer like myself, was shot by a mine guard in her head at point blank range because she told him to stop beating a striker. Mary Thomas kept our sisters at Ludlow singing Union songs while they burnt the colony down. Well, since we're here, and Johnny told you his version, I want you to hear what happened in your own state. Now, you have to know it was much harder to organize here for very reasons that he outlined. Out east, there were a lot of companies. You could shut down a few mines and get a negotiation. Here, the whole state was owned by 2 companies, Victor Fuel and then the largest, Colorado Fuel and Iron, Johnny's business. Well, finally, they had a UMW president who had a pair, John White, and he brought me back to Trinidad. First time we'd had an office in Trinidad, Colorado in 5 years. It was in 1913. I spoke. It was in their opera house. I don't believe that striking is the best way to solve anything. Arbitration is the way. To sit at the table, to negotiate between the government, the owner, and those that create the wealth. But Colorado's Governor Amon said he would not negotiate. Johnny refused. They said radicals were upsetting the working man and that we should leave. And so I say we have no alternative. We must strike. Well, Johnny, he didn't think they'd leave. He thought the workers were like little ants. He had made a little pay raise and he'd put more coal carts in the mine so there wouldn't be any stoppage. I'll tell you, our strike started on the 23rd, and on the 24th, John, I hope you're listening, 90% of the workers went out. We'll stand and fight together, we shall not be moved. We'll stand and fight together, we shall not be moved, just like the tree that's standing by the waters. We shall not be moved. Oh, well, immediately, every worker was thrown out of their shack. Now, the UMW had put up tent colonies and people moved into them. The UMW gave them some coal and some water and a few dollars, but the miners had to fish and hunt to put food on the table. The women, they did the chores together, and the children, they did all of their schoolwork. And in the evenings, we'd play baseball, take me out to the ball game, and sing. For a decent pay, we shall not be moved. For a decent pay, we shall not be moved, just like the tree that's standing by the waters. Well, you should have seen those tent colonies. Every kind of human was there. There were the Chinese and the Mexicans. There were the Slavs and the Greeks. There were 1,200 people at Ludlow speaking 24 different languages. Black and white together, we shall not be moved. Black and white together, we shall not be moved. Now, there was some fighting. And Johnny was right. My boys, some of them did buy guns. But the Baldwin Felts boys, they had machine guns. Albert Felts, the founder of those boys, he made a thing called the Death Special. It was an armored car with machine guns in 4 directions. I don't think that was quite a fair contest. In the face of violence, we shall not be moved. In the face of violence, we shall not be moved. Well, it was... Have you heard of Ethelbert Stewart? He was Wilson, that was the president then. He was Wilson's labor boy. And he said to the president, this is 10th century feudalism, which it was. There was not a civil or fair election in any of these places. The bosses and the government were like that. 10th century feudalism was being applied to a 20th century industrial situation. And Ethelbert begged for arbitration, but neither Governor Ammons nor Johnny went for that. Well, they were running out of money. Everybody was. The National Guard, the sheriffs, the private guard. What happened was the state ran out of money for the militia. So our friend Johnny said he would fund it. And he put more of those thugs with guns in militia uniforms, and they acted as one violent arm. Well, we were running out of money as well. So I had to leave, and I went to the East Coast and the West to raise money. I even went down to Juarez, Mexico, where I met Pancho Villa, and he promised to not allow any strike breakers, scabs over the border. And when I made my way back to Colorado, I was arrested. For what? Exercising my First Amendment rights? Well, they threw me in the Little Sisters of Charity Hospital turned prison for 9 long weeks. I was not allowed to see anyone except my lawyer. I was not allowed to read anything, to hear anything. When the Sister of Charity brought me my meals, she wouldn't even say hello. She had as much charity as those nuns I worked for in Michigan. Well, my lawyer got me a hearing with the Supreme Court of Colorado, but they released me 1 day before the hearing. Why? They had not a leg to stand on. And they said, out, get out of the state. So I went as far as Denver. I made a few speeches, and I was on my train ride back to Trinidad. And this time I was arrested right off the train. And the place they threw me this time looked like a holy vacation compared to the Little Sisters of Charity. It was a basement cell in the Waferno courthouse that had been condemned years before. I spent 27 days there fighting with sewer rats each night with a broken bottle. And again, I had a hearing in front of the Supreme Court of your fine state, and they released me 1 day before. I hadn't even been charged with anything. As soon as I was freed, I had to run off to give testimony to the subcommittee on mines and miners. That's where Johnny was as well. And it happened while I was gone. The 19th of April. It was Greek Easter. I could imagine the children hunting for what goodies people could afford to hide for them. The women and men singing, praying. A few days before, they had emptied the other camp, and we knew this one would be under fire soon. Many people, they had dug holes in the middle of their tents so that the women and children would have a safe place to go. Well, it was in the middle of their singing and praying that the bullets started coming at them. The men, of course, shot back. They had to defend themselves. But by midday, the workers' bullets ran out. Those that could ran across an arroyo and hid in the mountains. And then those forces came. They looted the entire tent colony and burnt it to the ground. It was the next morning, under a trap door, that they were found. 2 mothers and 11 children, asphyxiated. In the face of violence, we shall not be moved. In the face of violence, we shall not be moved. Just like the tree that's standing by the waters. It was hard. It was always hard. And the men were so beaten down, they couldn't fight for themselves sometimes. But do you know who they could always fight for? Their children. Now I'm going to go back a little, but know that even in this day, during this strike in Colorado, this was true. There were no labor laws protecting the babies in those days. And the workers, just to have a few more cents to buy a loaf of bread, sometimes had to send their children into the mines. Let me tell you, in a hole in the earth that a man couldn't fit in, a boy of 8 or 9 could fit. And he would spend 7 or 8 hours chinking away at a vein of coal. His little lungs filling with the dust. His skin looking like a black African when he came out. And outside the mine, there was a belt, a moving belt with coal and shale, and on it was a metal grating. And the children would stand on the metal grating, and their job was to lean over and to pull out the shale so that only the coal would get to the other end. Well, a few minutes of it was fun. A few hours got hard. 6 or 7 hours, they'd lose their sense. And a wee child would lose a finger or a hand or an arm or a life. And if I ever forgot what it was like, I would take a job in the mills of New England. Working at the great looms, you'd see the little children, 7 and 8 years old with the faces of 80, walking up and down and up the endless rows of spindles. If they grew tired, water was thrown on their face, the same water they had to pay for if they were thirsty. And those babies would reach their wee hands behind a machine if a thread broke, and they'd pull it out and fix it. And if the loom was closed down too soon or too late, they could lose some hair or a scalp or a life. I took an army of these children and I marched them through the mill towns and mining towns of this country, from Philadelphia all the way to New York to go see President Theodore Roosevelt. Let me tell you something about Theodore Roosevelt. In 1 hour, he got three bills passed to help the railroads. He raised $45,000 to wine and dine some German dignitary. He even supported a Georgian law to protect the songbirds. What about these babies from whom all song has been taken? Well, all along the way, I said, look, our kids are being killed and injured in the name of what? American progress. And I saw a man with all the fat of the land in his bank account. And he looked at these hungry, hollow-eyed, listless little children. And he said, of such is the kingdom of heaven. If heaven is filled with hungry little angel children, then I want to go to the other place where the bad boys and girls are. He didn't say nothing to me. Mister, there are a lot of empty cups in these kids' homes. Their fathers' cups are empty inside their dusty lunch pails. Who needs to drink the cup? They go to work when the sun is low. Dark when they leave, dark where they go. Through a gash in a mountain, down a 3-mile hole, where drag gable sparks like the 20-inch coal. Well, those babies had a wonderful time. The working families hosted them. They slept in beds all to themselves for the first time in many of their lives. They had fine meals. They even played at Coney Island on the way up. And then we arrived at Oyster Bay, New York, the summer home of President Theodore Roosevelt. And guess who was there to greet us? The Secret Service, for one old lady and some sick children. Well, I walked right past them, and I walked up to his door, and I knocked. And he was home, darlings. But it echoed through a hollow conscience. Tighten up your headings, set the wedges in. Crawl on your bellies, your troubles just start in. This day that's a night, this pit without sun. Tomorrow's a long shot that may never come. Who needs to drink the cup? Who needs to drink the cup? Those who live high at the top, or those who mine the dark way below. Others came, though. Newspaper reporters, journalists, photographers, they came, and they told the good people of this country the story of the mill and mining children. And by the very next year, there was a National Child Labour Committee. Who needs to drink the cup? Who needs to drink the cup? Now, I'll tell you, I am not blind to the shortcomings of my people. We are divided by greed, racism, and sometimes just downright stupidity. But this fact does not outweigh the fact that my class, the working class, is starved and beaten into submission. And every time we strike out against those forces, we are judged in the rigged courts of the ruling class. Gonna be a big takeover in this land.
Thank you, Mother Jones. And now, as promised, our guests would like to take questions together. Are there any questions from the audience for either Mr. Rockefeller or Mother Jones? All right, and I actually have some questions off of Facebook Live. This first one goes to Mr. Rockefeller. Who supported you and who didn't support your new plan? How about your family?
That's an excellent question. Who supported my new employee representation plan, and specifically my family? Well, my beautiful wife, Abby, has always been an excellent supporter of me. But I must say that my father, Mr. Rockefeller, has never been supportive of anything I've done in these last few years. He thinks my new liberal anti-unionism is weak and is paving the way for union dominance of the Rockefeller family empire. Well, it's my turn now, and I hope to make the world a better place like he could not.
All right, I believe our next question is coming from Marcia in our live audience.
Thank you. Thank you. I did see another question relating to your father. My question was, Mr. Rockefeller, if your father would have been in the position you were in, how do you think he would have handled it differently? Would it have been worse or better?
That is a difficult question to answer, of course, whether my father would handle the situations I have worse or better than my own. My own humility requires me to look upon my actions rather unfavorably, but I must be honest that I cannot look upon his actions in the past with any more favor. He is a rather hard man who solves problems rather harshly, and I at least hope I may spark some form of change, albeit the slightest may improve some lives. I doubt he would give any ground at all.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Rockefeller. Our next question comes from Facebook, and this one is from Mother Jones. Where did your sense of fairness come from and your sense of humor?
Surviving. If you don't laugh at a few things, then you're crying all the time, aren't you?
No doubt. All right. Is there any other questions right now from our live audience? If not, I have some more off of our Facebook audience. Don't want to miss anyone. All right, we'll go back to you, Mr. Rockefeller. How do you plan to respond to the hardship in the company towns? And what issues do you plan to address first? Is what Mother said about company scripts true?
It is indeed true, and that's one of the things I heard very often in my trip to Colorado. This employee representation plan is my main focus. Rather than attempting to solve individual problems, I hope to create a forum, a platform through which all problems may be addressed in turn as, not as they appear, but rather as they become so severe that they cannot be ignored. It will require the cooperation of all levels of Rockefeller family businesses, but I am confident that it will improve and it will work.
All right. And Marcia, do you have another question?
Mother Jones, I just applaud you for using women. Since that time, they were considered the weaker sex. How did you get husbands to allow their wives to do some of these life-threatening things?
Oh, darling, you're thinking about people like Johnny's wife, who's used to being treated in a lovely, kind way. But these women who share their lives with men who can barely put food on the table after working 10 and 12 hours a day, they would do anything to make their lives better. And they had no fear in their hearts. Why? Because death was always knocking at their door.
Thank you.
All right, I believe we have another question from our live audience from Dolly.
Yes, please. I'm wanting to know, Mr. John Rockefeller, do you think Rockefeller did enough for the people in that town, or should he have acted sooner?
I will always have regrets about my failure to stall the actions at Ludlow. I know many people blame me for it, and though I did not give any orders to open fire or any such thing, I do believe I was negligent. Now, in terms of helping them, I can do the best I can as a man in New York. Mother Jones has her way of helping the working man through force of voice and will, and I hope that my way of a quieter voice and maybe some better used money than I have in the past will do some good in the present that could not have been done in the past.
I have to say, you called me loud. I'm not loud, I'm passionate. And what you changed, John, was not the ways you treated the workers, but the ways you were perceived. There's a big difference.
Mr. Rockefeller, how did your father react to your work?
Well, he, of course, was the springboard into my place in the business world, working for him, preventing green mailing in New York. He was an early supporter of my work. And in many ways, I believe he hoped I would be a second version of himself, if that makes any sense, to do what he has done again. He has been rather hostile to my work, but amiable to me personally, I believe is the best way to put it. We are still family, even if he vehemently disagrees with me.
Thank you so much.
What wonderful questions. Not very often you get the opportunity to talk to such strong figures. Another question from Facebook is for Mother Jones. Where are you going next, and can you explain why?
Well, I go where I'm needed. I have no home. My home is wherever people call me. And as I explained, I've organized all over the country. So wherever the next fight is or needs to happen, I'm there to help people envision a brighter day and bring it to pass. Because if we don't do it for ourselves, I don't think we can rely on the empire builders to do it for us. We need a place at the table. We create their wealth. We deserve a place at the table.
Very solid answer. This next question is also directed at you. How do you think being a woman helps or hurts your causes?
I will shamelessly tell you that I used it a lot. So nobody knows actually how old I am. And sometimes I lose track myself. So one day I'd be saying, look at you, you're afraid to go out on strike. I'm 80 years old. I've never been afraid of anything, and I'm a woman. And next week I'd be talking to a group on strike, and I'd say, look at you, you're afraid. You don't want to keep your strike when I'm 83 years old. And as a woman, I've never been afraid. So nobody was sure of my age. But I think it was very helpful that I was a woman, that it spoke to people in a different way. And I did not give myself that name Mother. They did, but it resonated.
Definitely. Has anything stuck? Is there anything that you would wish you had done differently so far?
Are you speaking to Johnny or me?
Yes, that is to Mother Jones. I apologize.
All right, I wish my husband and children hadn't died. I wish workers were treated fairly for all they do. And then I could have a life and a home. But I can't. Not until that changes. And I've never regretted a thing I've done.
Okay. I have yet again another question for you, and maybe Rockefeller would also like to answer on this one on his personal thoughts as well. But it says, Mother Jones seems to be unfair to Teddy Roosevelt. He promoted the Square deal and busted trusts, including Standard Oil. Shouldn't you give him more credit?
Teddy? No. The man loved the industry, and he played right into their hands and gave them everything they wanted. And again, maybe they learned from Johnny's public relations men how to make him look like a kinder, gentler being. And he might have been to some, but certainly not to the workers. And those babies, how could you not answer the door when those babies are out there looking at your face? No. He just has no sympathy for me. But history's an interesting thing, isn't it? It depends who writes it, what you hear.
I must say, however, that Mr. Roosevelt is not entirely a friend of business either. He's taken several opportunities to speak out against myself in the aftermath of the Coalfield War. I believe he even called for my indictment.
But were you indicted, John?
Well, no.
All right. Again, just public relations. Sorry, dear, go on.
No, I believe another question would be wonderful.
All right. This is another one that you both can kind of answer to. Particularly though, Mother Jones, do you have any faith in Johnny's plan, or do you think he's got an ulterior motive? And Mr. Rockefeller, I invite you to share your response to her answer.
Johnny, as he mentioned, did invite me to his office. And I was quite impressed. Look at that baby face. He is such a sweet looking boy, is he not? That anyone would believe anything that came out of his mouth. And when he told me what he told you, that he didn't know what was going on there in Colorado and he was innocent of it. If you own a company, are you innocent of what happens within it? Governor Amons, he was paid off. He paid the Baldwin Felts boys. He knew what was going on. Johnny, come on. And I believed him for a while. And what a fool I was. And now, and he has these public relations men who helping him look much better. But I got to tell you, the policies haven't changed. They still don't want to pay us for dead work. They still weigh the coal themselves instead of letting a neutral force party bring in scales and weigh the coal. You ever think the coal is the same on a neutral scale and on a company scale? It is not. So we asked for that. We asked for an end of this horrible guard system. We asked for an 8-hour workday, which, let me tell you, is the law in Colorado, except when it comes to John's miners. And none of that changed. All right, John, your turn.
Thank you, Mother Jones. I know that despite our public relations efforts, I am not regarded well by many people. I know I will be called deceitful or holding ulterior motives. And I'm afraid that will likely always be true. And no matter what conviction I have to these new ideals I have found in this aftermath, I will be called so. Part of this difficulty is suddenly being separated from both the upper class and the worker class. Because now I am a dirty liberal to my father, and to the workers, I am still the heartless empire builder. Our conduct in Colorado was insufficient. And it will take us time to implement new policies, but that is what we are working towards. The strikers lost their strike. We are not keen on letting the union take over in Colorado. I do not believe they are any more trustworthy, any more upstanding than any company could be. And indeed, they have demonstrated no qualms about using deceit and violence to advance their aims either. That's, I suppose, what my hope for this plan is. And if we can find some form of agreement between all parties, we will be able to bypass the need for this outside destructive force. It rests upon the future to see if it works or not.
Thank you guys for both your responses. Dolly from our live audience, I believe, has a question. The next question for you guys.
Hang on.
I think you may be muted. If you want to try asking again.
Yes, I was wondering what makes Mother Jones so devoted to the causes? Question, who supported her travels, prison or lawyer, and how did she die?
Well, asking someone about their own death is a fool's errand. But I can tell you, when I worked for the United Mine Workers, I received a paycheck from them. And they're the ones that would help often, like I told you up in Ludlow, when they threw all the workers out, it was the United Mine Workers that put up the tent colonies. And that's what the money was for. And then I mentioned you, and I have done this many times, have gone to give speeches just to raise money to help keep strikes alive. There was no pot of gold for the workers anywhere, or for me. If you know of one, though, let me know. I'll go find it.
Was there any other questions?
There you get it.
Was there any other questions from our live audience? I have one more from Facebook, and then I think we'll transition. Marcia?
Well, we kind of touched on it, but Mr. Rockefeller, you said your wife was a great supporter, but did you get pressure from your family saying, hey, this is how we do things? You know what, we're ruthless, that's how we've made our money. And Mother Jones, how about you? Was your family mortified? I mean, at your age, you went to jails that were very unhealthy. You could have gotten very sick. Didn't they pressure you to quit?
John, you want to go first?
Yes, thank you. I will answer I will answer my question first. In terms of pressure from my family, yes, and from my colleagues and compatriots as well. My wife and children, one moment, allow me to rephrase. I hope to create a role model for my children, my wife and children, so that the Rockefeller family no longer feels such pressure when we hope to change things for the better or take these charitable actions in the future. My father and other such gentlemen have certainly made their feelings known to me, but now that I am in charge of CF&I and other companies, I am the one with the power, and they are the ones with the disapproving words, and nothing more.
And Dolly, my dear, my family, after the yellow fever took those of birth and my beloved, became the working people of this country. So I had family wherever I went.
All right, so our last question is for Mother Jones. Did you have any involvement with the workers in northern Colorado, specifically within the sugar beet industry?
Not the sugar beet, but the northern fields was where the western, the western miners were organizing, and John, you think the UMW was radical? Well, they were really radical. And the northern, and you're right, very good, northern and the southern fields were organizing at different times, and they had a slightly different population, and the northern fields went their way and the southern fields organized their own strike. And interestingly, a lot of the men who went out in the strike in 13 and 14 had been strike breakers at an earlier strike it was 1902. And they came in as scabs, and the conditions were so horrible, they joined the strikers 10 years later.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Rockefeller and Mother Jones. It is now my pleasure to introduce the scholars behind our presenters, Hayden, Hein, and Judith Black. I would first like to introduce Hayden. He was active in the Young Chautauqua program for 8 years, portraying such figures as T.E. Lawrence, Charles Martel, Charles de Gaulle, David Farragut, and his personal favorite, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. He is an active thespian who was the dramaturg for Barnum and performed in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Bye Bye Birdie, Flowers from Algernon, Something Rotten, and The Crucible during high school. As a junior at Greeley Central High School, he earned the title of National AP Scholar, and last year he sang in the Colorado All-State Tenor and Bass Choir. Transitioning to our second scholar, Judith Black has been featured on stages from the Montreal Comedy Festival to the Smithsonian Institution to the Art Museum of Cape Town. She has appeared 12 times at the National Storytelling Festival, and she creates original stories to augment everything from museums' missions to climate rallies. Locally, she is a Rotarian, a founding member of the Sustainable Marblehead, works for 350 Mass, gardens fanatically, and teaches the art of storytelling. Now, does anyone have any questions for either Hayden or Judith?
I have to say, I wish Hayden and I could have sung together. Wouldn't that have been fun?
No doubt. Wonderful presentations. I'll ask our live audience first if they have any questions. If not, I do have some questions from Facebook. Okay. We can start off with one of these. So this is to Judith. How are Mother Jones' contributions to labor and the working class regarded in our contemporary political climate? Is she given the credit she is due, or is she disregarded because she was a woman? And is her work still considered radical?
It depends which book you read, doesn't it? History is not a science. It is about facts and truths, and it depends who's collecting them and who writes it. So to some people, do you know Mother Jones magazine? Well, Hayden's heard of it, but Mother Jones magazine.
Yes, I've heard of it. Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's a wonderful activist magazine named after Mother Jones. So clearly she did create a huge legacy, but who read about her in high school? No. We don't have our high school students knowing about someone, a foul-mouthed, drinking female labor organizer. And, and you look at who writes these books and then who allows students to read them. And of course, she's not in them. So I would just beg you, when you look at history, try to look at it from as many vantage points as possible. You can look at it from the vantage point of the empire builders, but look at it from the vantage point of the women in that era, of the workers in that era, of the immigrants in that era. Get a full sense of the real history of a time and place, because usually there's no one book that'll ever give that to you.
That is a wonderful answer. I definitely have to attest that I had an amazing history teacher who really encouraged us to do that, and you learn a lot about history that way. This next one is to Hayden. Do you think that Rockefeller Jr. became a captain of industry or followed in the robber baron footsteps of his father?
Junior is sort of unique among that class of people who get sorted into robber baron, captain of industry, because he's kind of neither. He's not one of the men who builds America. He's one of the men who inherits America. And looking at him, perceptions range from tyrannical murderer, liar, etc., to naive idealist. And in the end, I would say he's further from robber baron than from captain of industry, if that makes any sense at all.
I think that makes a lot of sense. This next one is to Judith. Despite her harsh criticism of the exploiters of the world, did Mother Jones's concept of the human family extend even to them?
I don't understand. Extend to whom?
I believe it's referencing the exploiters, is what I'm getting at from this. It's interesting because she was a socialist, but she really believed that everyone should be at the table. She didn't want to end Johnny's reign. She didn't say, Johnny, give it up. She wanted a place at the table where workers were treated with the dignity they deserved. So she wasn't nearly as radical as, say, Marx, who said that the worker should take over the means of production. Okay,
she
I believe that answers.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. I just want to jump back to our live audience and make sure I'm not missing anyone. Do you guys have a question? Marcia, do you have one?
Yes, I just wanted to ask you, this is so wonderful. Thank you so much for participating in our Chautauqua. What were some of the challenges with doing it this way, or did you both feel really comfortable?
Go ahead, Hayden.
Doing it online is, of course, a challenge because it could not be, right? That way it wouldn't be fun. We, of course, all, I think, wished to be in person. And there were a couple things, like in my monologue, when I referenced the table, I would have had a table there to point at. That would have been nice, but it works out this way. There are some helpful, like quality of life things with our behind the scenes team helping us out, which are wonderful. Figuring out the back end and orchestrating and how it works online is new for everybody. And it took us some time. And well, we've all had different struggles with it. I'm sure Judith has some other insights too.
Well, Marcia, we have to thank Gina from the foundation, who's been amazing. Andrew, who's been and it's so cute because he usually manages Broadway shows, but instead he's managing us on this very unique platform that's been kind of very cool. And Colin, who's been working with us for a while on it, they're plus, like everything, every sword cuts two ways. So a live audience has such a dynamism to it. You know, you can feel people, you can move them. It's an amazing thing. With this modality, though, it's interesting. You can be more intimate. So you can come in and wink at people. You can share secrets. You can be dynamic by coming back. So it offers, and you can bring people from Massachusetts out there without burning fossil fuels. Yes. Well, okay, technology burns some fossil fuels, but not nearly as many, I think, as a plane trip there and back would have. So, yeah.
Yes. I think the online presence it brought its own challenges as well as some very unique opportunities as well. So that was a great question. From Facebook, Hayden, after your research, what are your thoughts about Rockefeller Jr. now?
Junior, looking at him, he is a conflicted figure in history, and I came into this character from a point of difficulty. He is, first of all, an introverted character and a primarily public speaking medium. And furthermore, I came into this looking at presenting a bad guy, right? Between Mother Jones and Rockefeller, which one is the defender of the people, and the which one is the tyrant oppressor? So researching him, it was immediately surprising to learn about him as his charity and his what I perceived as belief in this. That was very surprising. And there's a lot of irony all throughout his life and his work of things just not coming together just right. Or, and here's a fun fact. At Brown University, he was part of the mandolin club. That's a thing I learned about John D. Rockefeller Jr. He's a mandolin player.
I love Chautauqua in the sense that you learn such unique things about every character you seem to do. I'll ask this one for Judith. What sources did you use for?
I have histories of Mother Jones, a book called Mother Jones Speaks, all of her speeches. I tried to get newspaper reports about her so that you could get a lot of different vantage points. And it's always so fascinating what someone says about themselves versus what's said about them. So tried to get, and Hayden's shaking his head. So you try to get both of those when you come in to trying to be someone. She was not a shy person, as you guessed. And a little self-aggrandizing, but also she gave her life for this. I mean, every bit of it, and spent it in horrible jail cells and speaking out and sleeping on hard boards at night and not sleeping. So she deserved it. Every accolade that came her way.
Definitely. She's a very strong figure. And you don't see many people committed to that kind of, so hardly committed to a cause nowadays. Hayden, is it true that Rockefeller bribed the Colorado governor?
That's an interesting question. And one of the sources that I found most interesting when I was working on Rockefeller was a transcript of his testimony before the Industrial Relations Commission. And most of the questions weren't actually about Ludlow or the Coalfield War. They're about the aftermath, the trial of some of the workers, things like that. Rockefeller vehemently denied, that's how you say that word, denied any involvement, any bribery, anything like that. And in one instance, effectively stated that the post-strike trials and all of that came down to state authority and problems there rather than with CF&I and Rockefeller wealth. He denied it. Whether that's true or not, I can't say for sure.
Maybe it was his representatives.
That's potential. That's
when
possible.
you brought up Linder, I almost plotzed when you brought up Linderfelt, because Linderfelt was a notorious almost Nazi. He shot one of the Greek organizers. First, he hit him in the head with a rifle butt and then point blank shot him. And all of these people saw it. So this is what the country was like in those days. Everyone saw it, and he actually did go to court. And what did they convict him of? Mischief.
And meanwhile, 300 some strikers were accused of murder and charged with that.
Right. So it tells you who owned the system.
No doubt. Politics is a large factor, money in politics. Hayden, I really like this question. How did you work with young Chautauqua, or how did your work with young Chautauqua inspire some of the details for tonight's program?
I think rather than answering this question generally, I'd like to answer it with a specific anecdote that I remember from every single one of those 8 years of Young Chautauqua. I went through Chapelot and then Central, and all throughout that, we would have a guest come in to help us. Susan Marie was what she's known. And we would do a little piece of our performance for her, and she would critique it and, talk about how we need to envision the plane around us, put the audience in there. And one of the things I remember her saying from my very first year of Young Chautauqua was to use proper nouns. And I would try to do that very much here with Rockefeller, referring to Mr. Bowers, Mr. White, Mr. Tikas, and adding as many people and places as I can to sort of truly ground what I'm saying in history and tying it back to people and connecting those people to other things. And I hope it was effective.
I definitely think it was. Thank you guys both so much for your time tonight and being willing to participate in our online Chautauqua. I'm able to see a lot of comments coming in, and everyone said that you did a wonderful job, and they're just, one says, I love how, or you guys are extremely cool. So that makes your night. With that, I just want to conclude with a few thoughts, and we'll let you guys go. So, well, we weren't able to get to all of the questions this evening. We invite you to continue the conversation tomorrow. Please join us online for a full day of programming, starting with coffee and conversation tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., where you'll be able to talk with Judith Black and Hayden Hein more about their characters and their presentations. I hope you enjoyed your evening. Please make sure to tell your friends to tune in and watch some more amazing Chautauquans for the next 3 nights, and consider making a donation to help us build the program in 2022, which hopefully will be in person. So thank you again to our sponsors, partners, and donors, and to all of you for attending High Plains Chautauqua Online. Have a wonderful evening.